My name is Belle Vance. I'm 32 years old, and until recently, I worked as a mid-level compliance analyst for a financial services firm in Seattle. Most people who meet me describe me the same way: quiet, observant, reliable. The kind of woman who takes notes in meetings and rarely interrupts. The kind who remembers birthdays, who double-checks contracts, who corrects small, numerical inconsistencies without drawing attention to herself. Invisible, but useful. I've never been the loudest person in a room. I've never needed to be. I've always believed that if you pay attention long enough, the truth eventually introduces itself. What I'm about to tell you isn't a story about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontations or explosive family feuds. It's about something much quieter, something colder, something that unfolded so gradually I didn't recognize the shape of it until it was already wrapped around my life. I found out my mother was running a global scam ring using my identity as the mastermind. And by the time I understood what that meant, it was too late. The police raided my home at 6:12 a.m. on a Wednesday. They walked through my living room with the calm precision of people who were certain of what they would find. They called me by my full name, not Belle, but Isabella Marie Vance, and they used words like architect, financial orchestrator, and international fraud network. Meanwhile, my mother had vanished. No note, no forwarding address, no traceable bank accounts. Every cent of the stolen fortune is gone with her. To the authorities, I wasn't a daughter. I was a fugitive who hadn't realized she'd been exposed yet. To the world, I was suddenly the villain. But the truth is more complicated than that. It begins years earlier, in the subtle ways you're assigned a role inside your own family. In the small dismissals you learn to swallow. In the way, responsibility can quietly turn into liability when someone understands your strengths better than you understand their intentions. This story is about misdirection, about documentation, about silence becoming a strategy. It's about how I survived something designed to erase me, without screaming, without theatrics, and without becoming the monster they thought I was. I won't dramatize what happened. I won't exaggerate my pain. I'll tell you exactly what I saw, what I missed, and what I chose. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the loudest one. It's the one who's been underestimated long enough to see everything clearly. Have you ever looked back at a moment in your life and realized the warning signs were there all along? You just didn't know what you were looking at? I've always been the responsible one. Not in a heroic way, not in a way that earned applause, just in the quiet, dependable way that makes people assume you'll handle things and then forget to thank you for handling them. In my family, roles were assigned early. My mother was charismatic, magnetic, the kind of woman who could walk into a room of strangers and leave with phone numbers, favors, and opportunities. She spoke quickly, confidently, always one step ahead of the conversation. I was the opposite. I preferred spreadsheets to speeches, documentation to improvisation. I liked clarity. I liked the rules. I liked knowing exactly where money was going and why. Growing up, that made me the practical one, the cautious one, the one who worried too much. My mother would laugh and say, "Belle sees danger in everything." It sounded affectionate. Everyone would smile. I would smile too. But what she meant was this: I was predictable. Predictable people are easy to build around. When I graduated and started working in compliance, she bragged about me constantly. "My daughter works in financial investigations," she'd say at dinners. "She understands international regulations." It sounded like pride. Maybe part of it was. But what no one noticed, what I didn't notice, was how often she asked detailed questions. Not about my life. About systems. About identity verification processes. About how banks flag suspicious activity. About how long it takes for internal audits to escalate. I answered because I believed in transparency, because she was my mother, because I assumed curiosity was harmless. In our extended family, I was the stable one, the one who reviewed contracts before anyone signed them, the one who caught hidden fees in car leases, the one who set up two-factor authentication for older relatives who didn't understand phishing emails. I was useful, and usefulness becomes expectation faster than you think. When my mother started consulting for international clients, she framed it as entrepreneurship, cross-border e-commerce, digital investment facilitation. She traveled often: London, Toronto, Sydney. She said the world was becoming global, and she was simply adapting. Whenever paperwork arrived at the house, courier envelopes with foreign stamps, registered mail requiring signatures, she'd ask me to glance at it. "Just make sure it's legitimate, Belle. You're better at these things." I would skim. I would confirm that the letterheads looked authentic. I would say, "It seems fine." I never imagined that my confirmation carried weight beyond reassurance. To me, I was just being helpful. To her, I was credible. There's something you should understand about being the quiet one. In a family dominated by a charismatic parent, you learn to exist in the margins. You don't compete for attention. you observe, you adapt, and slowly you become infrastructure. I handled online account setups when she complained about technical glitches. I explained authentication protocols. I once helped her recover access to an email account by answering security questions she claimed to have forgotten. "What would I do without you?" she'd say. At the time, it felt like affection. Now, when I replay those moments, I hear something else beneath them. Dependency can be strategic. The night before the police raid, I went to bed believing I was the steady, rational daughter of an ambitious but harmless entrepreneur. I believed I had built a quiet, respectable life, defined by caution and integrity. But to the people building a case file somewhere downtown, I wasn't the responsible one. I was the architect. And the worst part? When they laid out the timeline later, the shell companies registered in my name, the encrypted communication accounts tied to my credentials, the digital signatures that matched my verified identity, I could see exactly how it had been constructed, piece by piece, using the very qualities everyone had once praised me for. Predictable, responsible, trustworthy. Tell me something. Have you ever realized that the traits people admire in you might also be the ones they're quietly using? The first time something felt wrong, it didn't look like a crime. It looked like paperwork. I remember the envelope because it was heavier than usual. Cream stock international postage. My name printed in precise block letters. Belle Isabella Vance. Not handwritten, not casual, formal, official. My mother slid it across the kitchen island while stirring her tea. "Can you sign for this?" she asked. "It's just some international registration thing. They put your name down because you're better with documentation." I should have asked more questions. Instead, I looked at the return address, a business registry in the UK. I scanned the letterhead. Everything appeared legitimate. There was a registration number, an embossed seal, and contact information. It was structured the way real documents are structured. "That's odd," I said lightly. "Why is my name on it?" She didn't hesitate. That's something I recognize now, how seamless her answers were. "It's temporary. It's easier to register cross-border operations under someone with a clean compliance background. You don't even have to do anything, it's administrative." Administrative. In my field, that word is soothing. It implies harmless bureaucracy. I signed. Not a forged signature, not a trick. I signed willingly, though without understanding context. That was the first small cut. Nothing dramatic happened afterward. No alarms, no calls. Life continued. She traveled more frequently. I focused on my job. But a few weeks later, I received an email from a foreign banking institution thanking me for opening a corporate account. I stared at the screen for a long time. I hadn't opened any account. When I called her, she laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, Belle, it's just the back-end processing from that registration. These systems are automated. It's not active yet. Don't overthink it." Overthinking. That was always the word used when I noticed inconsistencies. I logged into the portal linked in the email. Two-factor authentication pinged my phone, a number she had insisted I use for backup access months earlier. The account existed, but it showed zero balance, no transactions, dormant. I told myself this was what administrative lag looked like. Here's the part that still unsettles me. Nothing technically illegal was visible at that stage. No fraudulent transfers, no red flags, just infrastructure. But infrastructure matters. In compliance, we're trained to watch for layering, the slow establishment of entities before movement begins. Shell companies often sit inactive before activation. I knew that, and still I rationalized, because she was my mother, because the idea that she would intentionally entangle me in something criminal felt absurd, because the alternative, that she understood exactly how to weaponize my clean professional record, was too disturbing to hold. The second small cut came when she asked me to verify a digital signature certificate. "Just check if this encryption is valid," she said. "You're the expert." I examined it. It was sophisticated, internationally recognized certification authority, secure, valid, I confirmed. La misal mat. What I didn't realize then was that the certificate was attached to a communication channel that investigators would later identify as command-level correspondence. My verification didn't create the fraud, but it legitimized it. At the time, though, it felt like routine assistance. When subtle boundary shifts happen gradually, they don't trigger alarms. They trigger justifications. "She wouldn't do that." It's probably procedural. You're being paranoid. Each small doubt was sanded down by familiarity. And every time I chose not to escalate my concern, the foundation solidified. No shouting, no threats, no visible cruelty. Just one signature, one verification, one confirmation at a time. Looking back, that's what makes the first small cut so dangerous. It doesn't hurt enough to pull away. Have you ever dismissed your own instinct because trusting someone felt easier than questioning them? After the first few irregularities, something subtle began to shift. Not in the legal structure around me, but in the emotional one. My concerns stopped being taken seriously. At first, it was small. If I asked for clarification about a document, my mother would sigh. Not dramatically, just enough for me to feel it. Belle, sweetheart, not everything is a compliance review. Everyone around us would chuckle. I learned to soften my tone, to preface questions with apologies. I'm probably overthinking this, but this might be nothing, but over time, my instinct to question became framed as a personality flaw. Caution turned into rigidity, attention to detail turned into anxiety, and I let that framing settle. It's strange how quickly you can start editing yourself when the room collectively decides you're too much. Not loud. I was never loud, just too meticulous, too skeptical, too serious. My mother's ventures expanded. She talked about global partnerships now, digital asset arbitrage, cross-border liquidity channels. The language grew more complex, more abstract, impressive enough to silence relatives who might have asked harder questions. Whenever I raised practical concerns, she would gently redirect the conversation. You worry because you work inside the system set, she'd say. Entrepreneurs operate outside it. It sounded visionary, it sounded bold, and slowly, I became the cautious background character in her story of innovation. That's how normalization happens. Not through cruelty, through contrast. She became a risk taker. I became the worrier. So when another registration appeared in my name, this time in Canada, I didn't confront her immediately. I told myself it was likely procedural again. I had already signed something once. Perhaps this was just an expansion. When a courier delivered encrypted hardware to our address, addressed to me, she brushed it off. Temporary routing. It's safer that way. Safer for whom? I didn't ask that out loud. Because every time I approached the edge of confrontation, I felt the same internal resistance. I didn't want to be the difficult daughter. I didn't want to imply mistrust. I didn't want to fracture the image of us as competent, modern women navigating a global world. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Part of me admired her boldness. She moved through airports with ease, negotiated deals on calls at odd hours, spoke about currencies the way I spoke about audit trails. I told myself she was operating in spaces I didn't fully understand, that my caution might be provincial. Maybe I was too institutionalized by my corporate environment to grasp entrepreneurial agility. So I adjusted. I stopped logging into the foreign accounts. I stopped double-checking confirmation emails. I stopped pushing when explanations felt incomplete. Not because I believed them, but because the social cost of questioning became heavier than the logical discomfort of ignoring. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. No one says, you don't matter. They simply teach you that your instincts are inconvenient. The night before everything collapsed, my mother returned from Sydney with a new confidence in her step. She hugged me, kissed my cheek, and said, "You'll thank me one day for trusting me." At the time, I thought she meant financially. Now I understand she meant structurally, because by then, the architecture was complete, and I had already been written into it. Tell me, when was the last time you quieted yourself just to keep the peace? There's a moment in every long manipulation where you realize you weren't just helping, you were cast. Not accidentally, not loosely, precisely. By the time my mother's operations stretched across 3 countries, my role had solidified into something almost ceremonial. I was the validator, the stabilizer, the clean name attached to complex structures that needed to look legitimate from a distance. She never called it that, of course. She called me her foundation. Every visionary needs someone grounded, she would say at dinner parties. Belle keeps me realistic. People would smile at me warmly. They'd compliment my career, my discipline, my seriousness. I didn't see that what they were really complimenting was the illusion of oversight. Behind the scenes, my name began appearing in places I didn't actively manage. Advisory listings, corporate filings, digital authorization hierarchies. Each one is positioned carefully, not as a visible executive, not as a loud spokesperson, as the architect, the one who could plausibly understand complex financial flows, the one whose professional background would withstand scrutiny. And because I had always been the responsible one, no one questioned it, least of all me. When I'd notice a new document requiring acknowledgement, she'd frame it as a temporary delegation. It's just to streamline international compliance, she'd explain. Your background makes things smoother. Smoother. That word hid so much. I began to notice a pattern in how she spoke about me to others. She praised my intelligence, but always in a way that reinforced utility. Belle's brilliant with systems. Belle handles the technical aspects. Belle understands the regulatory landscape. She rarely described my personality. Rarely are my interests. Rarely do my emotions. I wasn't her daughter in those conversations. I was her infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't argue. It supports. Looking back, I can see how carefully she avoided overt control. There were no threats, no ultimatums, no emotional blackmail. Just an assumption. She assumed I would help. She assumed I would sign. She assumed I would verify. And because I had always fulfilled expectations, I fulfilled these too. There's a dangerous comfort in being the reliable one. You start believing your worth is measured in functionality. If you withdraw support, who are you? The turning point wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was a dinner with one of her partners, a man from London with a polished accent and unsettlingly precise questions. He looked at me and said, "You designed the layered transfer architecture, correct?" The table went quiet for half a second. I felt my mother's gaze on me, calm, expectant. There it was, the role, fully formed. Architect. I forced a small smile and said, "I handle compliance." He nodded slowly, as if amused by modesty. That night, I lay awake replaying the word. Architecture implies intentional design. It implies ownership. It implies control. I had none, but on paper, somewhere, it appeared that I did. And in legal structures, paper matters more than emotion. For the first time, a thought moved through me not as doubt, but as clarity. If something collapses, I won't be seen as the daughter. I'll be seen as the mastermind. The role had already been written. I had just been performing it unknowingly. Have you ever realized you were living inside a script someone else drafted? And you never agreed to the part? The shift didn't happen during the raid. It happened 3 weeks before that, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, in my own living room, with rain pressing softly against the windows. My mother was in Toronto. At least that's what she had told me. I was alone, reviewing quarterly compliance reports for work, when an unfamiliar notification appeared on my laptop. It wasn't from my employer. It was from one of the foreign banking portals I had stopped checking months earlier. Administrative update. Beneficial ownership structure amended. That phrase froze me. Beneficial ownership. In financial investigations, that's the layer beneath the visible director. The person who actually controls assets. The one who benefits from them. The one authority ultimately looks for. I logged in. This time there was no zero balance. The numbers on the screen were so large they didn't register at first. Multiple currencies, layered transactions, inbound transfers from entities registered in different jurisdictions. Outbound transfers are routed through intermediary accounts. Structured, timed, cleanly executed. It was sophisticated. And under primary architect of transfer framework, my name appeared. Not as a clerical error, not buried, prominently. There was even an encrypted communication archive tied to a digital certificate I had once verified. Conversations I had never seen. Instructions written in language that mirrored my professional vocabulary. Compliance terminology, risk mitigation phrasing, regulatory loophole references. It was as if someone had studied how I spoke and replicated it. I didn't panic. That's the part that surprises me now. I didn't cry. I didn't call her immediately. I sat very still. When your entire identity is built around precision and integrity, discovering a parallel version of yourself operating in secret doesn't create hysteria. It creates calculation. I opened a new notebook, not my usual black leather one, a fresh one. I began documenting timestamps, account numbers, jurisdictions, screenshots saved to an encrypted external drive. The more I mapped it out, the clearer the architecture became. Shell companies were registered gradually over 2 years. Accounts are layered to obscure origin points. Digital authorizations are structured to route through credentials linked to me. And at the outermost layer, invisible to surface review, sat beneficiary accounts with ownership masked through trusts. Trusts, my mother had once mentioned casually in passing. That was the moment something shifted internally. Not anger, distance. For the first time, I stopped viewing her actions through the lens of misunderstanding. This wasn't impulsive entrepreneurship. It wasn't administrative confusion. It was designed, and I had been the design's shield. I didn't confront her when she called that evening. I listened to her talk about meetings and investors and momentum. I responded normally, calm, warm, measured. But something fundamental had changed. Silence was no longer compliance. Silence was observation. I realized then that any emotional confrontation would only alert her. If she had built something this intricate, she would anticipate suspicion. She would pivot, erase, reroute. So I did the only thing that aligned with who I truly was. I gathered evidence, quietly, thoroughly, because if I was going to survive what this would inevitably become, I needed clarity, not outrage. And clarity begins with documentation. Have you ever felt the exact second your innocence disappeared? Not because you did something wrong, but because you finally understood what someone else had done. After that Sunday, I didn't confront her. Not because I was afraid, because I understood something she had underestimated about me. I don't move without evidence. If she had spent 2 years constructing a network layered enough to withstand international scrutiny, then one emotional phone call wouldn't dismantle it. It would only warn her. So I chose silence. But this time, silence wasn't obedience. It was a strategy. When she returned from Toronto, she hugged me the way she always did. Warm, confident, unhurried. She asked about my week. She complimented my discipline. She spoke about scaling operations and entering new markets. I watched her differently now. Not as a daughter seeking reassurance. As an analyst observing a subject, I noticed how carefully she avoided specifics. How she spoke in visionary language, but never operational detail. How she positioned herself publicly as a connector, a facilitator. never the architect. That role remained mine, and I let her believe I hadn't noticed. At dinner, she mentioned expanding into Australia. That's ambitious, I said evenly. It's evenly. She smiled. Ambition is misunderstood by cautious people. Cautious. That word used to sting, now it is clarified, because caution is what keeps systems from collapsing, and I was beginning to see exactly where this one would fracture. In the weeks that followed, I maintained my routine. I went to work. I attended meetings. I responded to emails. At home, I documented every new notification from foreign institutions, every adjustment to ownership layers, every encrypted archive update. I mirrored data into secure storage, not linked to any account she could access. I began researching extradition treaties, jurisdictional cooperation agreements, statutes of limitation for cross-border financial crimes. I didn't do it dramatically. I did it quietly, after 10 p.m., with the same patience I use when reviewing audit discrepancies. Here's what I understood. If authorities were tracing this network, they would eventually follow the cleanest trail. And that trail led directly to me, the architect. What she hadn't accounted for was that I had access to the same regulatory knowledge she was exploiting. I knew how investigations escalate. I knew how long it takes for suspicious transaction reports to aggregate into actionable intelligence. There was a timeline, and we were nearing the end of it. She mistook my calm for continued compliance. Once she even said, "I'm so grateful you trust me, Belle." Most daughters would panic at the scale of what I'm building. I looked at her and realized something chilling. She genuinely believed trust was still the foundation. She didn't see that I had shifted from trust to assessment. Silence, in families like ours, had always meant harmony. Now it meant preparation. I stopped correcting small inconsistencies in her explanations. I stopped offering unsolicited risk analysis. I let her assume I remained in the assigned role, reliable, useful, invisible. Because invisibility has advantages. No one monitors the quiet one. No one suspects the infrastructure. But infrastructure, when it withdraws support at the right moment, can cause an entire structure to fold under its own weight. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning survival. And survival requires patience. Tell me, have you ever chosen not to react? Not because you were weak, but because you were waiting for the right moment to understand everything first? There's a misconception about preparation. People imagine it as dramatic. Secret meetings, whispered plans, visible tension. But real preparation is almost invisible. It looks like routine. After I chose silence, I shifted into something that felt instinctual. The part of me trained to notice patterns began mapping everything with clinical precision. Not just the financial architecture, the behavioral one. My mother had rhythms. She traveled after large transaction spikes. She increased her charm in family settings when new entities were registered. She used the phrase momentum right before activating dormant accounts. These weren't emotional observations, they were timestamps. I created a parallel timeline. Corporate registration dates, account activations, communication certificate updates, her travel schedule, my own digital authentication logs. Side by side, the pattern sharpened. The digital authorizations tied to my credentials were executed during narrow windows, usually when I was physically at work, logged into secure systems, my IP address consistent with normal professional activity. It was elegant. If anyone ran a surface-level audit, the activity would align with a compliance professional's daily schedule. That's when I understood the depth of it. She hadn't just used my name. She had used my predictability. The 8:47 a.m. login before my first meeting. The 12:18 p.m. lunch break was when I checked emails. The 9:32 p.m. light browsing before bed. The timestamps of the fraudulent authorizations mirrored those habits almost perfectly. She had studied me. That realization could have broken me. Instead, it focused me. I began documenting my physical whereabouts in ways I never had before. Not publicly, quietly. Rideshare receipts, office entry logs, calendar confirmations, cloud backups. I installed a secondary security key on all my personal devices, one she had never touched. I changed authentication structures gradually so nothing would trigger immediate alerts. At work, I volunteered for a cross-departmental training on emerging financial crime patterns. It gave me access to anonymized case studies, real investigations, real escalation frameworks. I wasn't looking for inspiration. I was looking for timing. International fraud investigations rarely erupt overnight. They build. Data accumulates across jurisdictions. Suspicious transaction reports get filed. Algorithms flag anomalies. Eventually, a threshold is crossed. And when it is, enforcement doesn't knock politely. They arrive with certainty. I knew that. So I prepared not for a confrontation with her, but for confrontation with them. What she never noticed was that I stopped asking her operational questions entirely. I no longer offer advice, no longer corrected minor regulatory risks. She likely interpreted that as trust. It was actually detachment. I was no longer part of the structure emotionally. I was analyzing it externally. One night, while reviewing archived encrypted communications tied to the certificate I had once validated, I found something that solidified my understanding. A message thread between offshore administrators discussing central narrative positioning. One line read, "Public-facing architect has a clean institutional background. Maintain her visible normalcy." Public-facing architect. Me. They had built a story, not just financial roots, a narrative. If exposure happened, the authorities would find a calm, competent compliance analyst with international digital authorization trails. Plausible, convincing, replaceable. What they didn't account for was documentation outside their system, because while they were constructing a case against the version of me they designed, I was quietly constructing a record of the version of me that actually existed. And records, when organized properly, can dismantle assumptions. Have you ever realized that while someone was building a story about you, you were the only one collecting the truth? The private reveal didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in my bedroom at 1:14 a.m., illuminated only by the soft glow of my laptop screen. I had been tracing a series of outbound transfers routed through a layered trust structure registered in Sydney. On paper, it looked airtight. Beneficiary shielded, trustees rotated, compliance documentation filed just convincingly enough to avoid immediate scrutiny. But there was a flaw, not a technical one, a human one. One of the trustee entities had been incorporated 2 days before a large liquidity movement, but the digital signature certificate used in that incorporation linked back to the same certification authority I had once verified, the same encryption family, the same structural phrasing in its metadata. Consistency is usually a strength. Here, it was a fingerprint. I cross-referenced the metadata timestamps with my documented physical location logs. The authorization occurred at 11:06 a.m. Pacific time. At 11:06 a.m., I had been presenting a compliance briefing in a glass-walled conference room downtown. My corporate badge entry, calendar invite attendance, and internal meeting recording all confirmed it. It wasn't just improbable that I had executed that authorization. It was impossible. That was the first clean fracture in the narrative built around me. I didn't celebrate. I felt something steadier than relief. Clarity, because for weeks I had been documenting anomalies, collecting fragments. But this was a structural contradiction, a point where the version of me in their system collided with the verifiable version of me in reality. The second reveal came minutes later. Buried in the trust documentation was a beneficiary reallocation clause, one that activated automatically under executive incapacitation or disappearance. The primary beneficiary under that clause was not me. It was her, fully shielded, fully external to the visible architecture. If the architect, meaning me, were investigated, charged, or legally restricted, asset control would transition seamlessly to a beneficiary entity that traced back through 3 degrees of separation to my mother. It wasn't just identity theft. It was contingency planning. She hadn't merely used my name as cover. She had engineered a system where my exposure secured her control. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. This wasn't impulsive greed. It wasn't desperation. It was strategic insulation. And the final piece of the reveal was the simplest. A travel booking confirmation in her archived email, timestamped just hours before a scheduled high-volume transfer window, a one-way ticket with flexible routing through countries without immediate extradition alignment. She had exit routes, planned, timed. The realization settled slowly. The raid, when it came, wouldn't surprise her. It would activate her. And if I confronted her now, she would accelerate that exit plan. So the private reveal gave me 2 things: proof and a countdown. For the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was anticipating. I began organizing my documentation into a structured disclosure file. Not emotional, not accusatory, chronological, verifiable, cross-referenced. If enforcement arrived, I wouldn't argue. I would present the sequence, because sequence tells a story more convincingly than outrage ever could. That night, I closed my laptop and looked at my reflection in the darkened window. I didn't feel betrayed anymore. I felt resolved. Have you ever reached a point where the truth no longer hurts? It simply clarifies what you have to do next. Once clarity arrives, emotion becomes secondary. The night I uncovered the beneficiary clause and the exit routing, I understood something irreversible. This would not resolve quietly. There were only 3 possible paths forward. The first was confrontation. I could call her into the kitchen, lay out the documentation, and demand an explanation. I could watch her face carefully as I described the structural contradictions, the metadata fingerprint, the impossibility of my physical presence during certain authorizations. But confrontation would serve her. Not me. She had already demonstrated strategic foresight. If she sensed exposure, she would accelerate movement. Funds would be redirected, accounts liquidated, exit routes were activated ahead of schedule, and I would still be left holding the visible architecture. The second option was silence, permanent silence. I could do nothing, continue documenting, Hope investigations, if they came, would eventually distinguish me from the system built in my name. But hope is not a strategy. In international financial enforcement, the visible architect is the first target. The clean professional background makes the case stronger, not weaker. Sophisticated insider leveraging institutional knowledge, that narrative would write itself. Waiting passively meant risking arrest without preparation. The third option was irreversible. Preemptive disclosure, not dramatic whistleblowing, not public exposure. Strategic, documented, controlled disclosure to the appropriate authorities before escalation triggered a raid. It meant stepping into scrutiny voluntarily. It meant accepting that my name would be associated with the case publicly. It meant risking disbelief, because from the outside, it would look convenient. The alleged architect suddenly claiming victimhood. But timing matters. If I disclosed before enforcement action, the narrative would shift from reactive defense to proactive reporting. It would establish a sequence. It would demonstrate awareness before accusation. It would also permanently fracture any remaining illusion of loyalty between us. I sat at my desk for a long time, weighing it. This wasn't about revenge. It was about control over the story attached to my identity. For years, I had allowed my role to be defined by usefulness, by reliability, by quiet support. Now I had to decide whether I would continue protecting someone who had already engineered my exposure, or protect myself. The irreversible choice wasn't about sending documents. It was about accepting that my relationship with my mother, as I had known it, was already gone. Because once disclosure happens, there is no return to shared dinners and soft reassurances. There is no pretending the architecture was accidental. There is only truth. And truth, once documented, cannot be withdrawn. I opened my secure file and reviewed it one last time. Chronology, cross-references, authentication logs, metadata analysis, beneficiary clauses, travel alignment. Complete. I drafted a concise executive summary, neutral tone, no emotional language, just facts. Then I scheduled a consultation request with a federal financial crimes attorney for the following morning. Not to accuse her, to protect myself legally before any formal contact with enforcement. That was the moment the decision solidified. I would not confront her privately. I would move strategically, because if she had designed me as the architect of her system, then I would become the architect of its unraveling. Not through noise, but through sequence. Have you ever chosen the path that cost you a relationship, simply because it was the only path that protected your integrity? The morning after I scheduled the consultation, I went to work as usual. Routine is camouflage. At 9:03 a.m., I sat across from a federal financial crimes attorney in a glass office overlooking Elliott Bay. I didn't dramatize. I didn't speculate. I handed him a structured disclosure file organized by jurisdiction, entity, and timestamp. He didn't interrupt while I explained the sequence. When I finished, he asked only one question. Are you prepared for this to become public? I said yes. Because privacy had already been compromised the moment my name became the visible architect of a global fraud structure. He advised immediate controlled disclosure through counsel, not directly to investigators without representation. We drafted a preemptive statement of concern, requesting a formal review of identity misuse and fraudulent authorization. The tone was precise, not defensive, not accusatory, not emotional, just chronological. Within 48 hours, the first confidential inquiry was initiated. Quietly, no public record yet. And here's what most people misunderstand. Once you step into legal channels voluntarily, you are no longer simply a suspect profile in a database. You become a participant in the investigation. That distinction matters. At home, nothing changed outwardly. My mother spoke about expansion into new digital markets. She mentioned liquidity events scheduled within weeks. Liquidity events. Translation, major transfers. Through my attorney, we coordinated with investigators to flag specific transfer windows without triggering premature action. The goal wasn't spectacle. It was preservation of evidence and traceability. I continued my normal login habits. I allowed the system to believe the visible architect remained unaware. Meanwhile, back-end monitoring intensified. Every time an account was activated, it was mirrored. Every certificate update is flagged. She didn't notice. She still assumed silence meant compliance. One evening, she asked casually, if regulators ever came knocking, you'd handle it, right? You know how to talk to them. I looked at her steadily and said, I know how to document. She smiled as if reassured, but I wasn't reassuring her. I was reminding myself who I was. The irreversible part of this phase wasn't emotional, it was legal. Once disclosures are filed, timelines shift. Warrants begin forming in the background. International cooperation requests get drafted. Investigations don't explode immediately. They tighten, and tightening is invisible until it isn't. I slept calmly during that period, not because I was unafraid, because for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't behind the narrative. I had stepped ahead of it. The raid, when it came, would not be a surprise to me, but it would be to her. Have you ever moved so quietly toward protection that the person who underestimated you never realized the ground was shifting beneath them? The first visible consequence wasn't the raid. It was silent, a different kind of silence. 3 days after the flagged liquidity window, one of the offshore accounts failed to complete a scheduled transfer. The system didn't crash. It didn't alert publicly. It paused. Behind the scenes, compliance holds had been placed. Not aggressive enough to spook operators immediately, just enough to require additional verification. That's how investigations begin tightening. Friction. That evening, my mother paced the kitchen while pretending not to be unsettled. International banks are becoming paranoid, she muttered. Too much regulatory noise lately. I stirred my tea calmly. That's predictable. She looked at me briefly, studying my face as if searching for something. Panic? Suspicion? Alignment? She found none. Another transfer window approached. Another delay. This time a request for enhanced documentation on beneficial ownership structures. The request wasn't random. It targeted the exact trust I had identified in my disclosure file. Her tone changed slightly that night, less confident, more clipped. These bureaucrats think they can slow innovation, she said. Innovation. The word sounded thinner now. Over the next week, communication frequency increased between the offshore administrators. The encrypted archive, which investigators now monitored, showed subtle shifts in language. Review exposure points. Reconfirm primary narrative alignment. Prepare contingency reallocation. Contingency. That word mattered. She began spending more time on private calls behind closed doors. Her travel inquiries spiked. Flexible routes. Multiple departure cities. But here's what she didn't anticipate. International coordination had already begun. Flagged accounts don't release quietly once federal attention is formalized. They freeze methodically. The third failed transfer was the turning point. Funds remained suspended, pending review. For the first time, she lost composure in front of me. Not dramatically, not screaming, just a brief crack in tone. This is temporary, sissy said it's almost to persistia, it's procedural. I nodded slowly. Administrative lag. The same phrase she had once used on me. Her eyes flickered at that. Recognition, suspicion, I couldn't tell. But something had shifted. Consequences in financial systems don't arrive as explosions. They arrive as erosion. Liquidity reduced. Access limited. Movement constrained. The architecture she had built so carefully was still standing, but key support beams were under inspection. Meanwhile, I received formal acknowledgement from investigators that my voluntary disclosure had been logged and evaluated as credible. No public announcement, no dramatic headlines. Just confirmation that I was positioned differently within the case file. Participant, not an architect. The weight in my chest lightened slightly. Not relief, yet, but alignment. At dinner one night, she asked casually, if someone tried to frame you in a financial structure, you'd know how to fight it, right? The question was too precise to be random. I met her gaze and said, I'd make sure the sequence of events was documented correctly. We held eye contact for a long moment. That was the first time I sensed she might understand that I understood. But by then, it was already too late to recalibrate, because once friction enters a system at the regulatory level, reversal is rare, and the erosion had begun. Have you ever watched something powerful slowly lose control? Not through attack, but through exposure? The morning of the raid began quietly. 6:12 a.m., 3 firm knocks on the door, measured, professional, certain. I was already awake. Not because I expected them that morning. Investigations don't send calendar invites, but because the atmosphere in the house had changed in recent days. My mother had slept less. Travel bags sat half-packed near the hallway closet. When I opened the door, there were no raised voices, no dramatic declarations, just credentials displayed calmly and a warrant presented with my full legal name printed clearly across the top. Isabella Marie Vance, architect of an international fraud network. I stepped aside. They moved through the house methodically. Laptops, external drives, filing cabinets, communication devices. One agent asked, are you aware of these entities registered under your name? Yes, I replied evenly, and I've already provided documentation to federal counsel. There was a brief pause, a subtle shift in posture, professional recognition. They weren't surprised by my answer. That told me coordination had already occurred. My disclosure had landed. But here's the part that still feels surreal. My mother was gone. Sometime between midnight and dawn, she had activated the exit route. Her phone remained on the kitchen counter, powered down. Her closet is half empty, passport missing. No confrontation, no goodbye, just absence. And in her absence, the visible architect remained. Me. To neighbors watching from behind curtains, the image was simple. Law enforcement entering my home at dawn. Evidence boxes carried out. My name was quietly added to investigative databases. Narratives don't wait for nuance. Online sites and speculations surfaced within hours, once court filings became searchable. Compliance expert mastermind's global scam. It fit cleanly. Clean background, technical knowledge, international links. Convincing. But behind the scenes, something irreversible had already been established. Timeline sequence, voluntary disclosure, metadata contradictions, physical location logs. The agents didn't arrest me that morning. They conducted interviews, requested clarifications, took possession of devices I had already mirrored. One of them said quietly, "You moved early." "Yes," I answered, because too late would have meant handcuffs instead of questions. By midday, international arrest notices were being drafted. Not in my name, in hers. But she had vanished into jurisdictions designed for delay. Countries where extradition requests travel slowly through diplomatic channels. Places are chosen carefully in advance. Every cent of the accessible liquid funds had already shifted into layered beneficiary accounts, shielded beyond immediate freeze authority. The architecture had fractured, but not collapsed entirely, and I stood at the center of its visible wreckage. Public perception doesn't recalibrate overnight. Even with cooperation, even with documentation, even with alignment, there is a period where you exist inside suspicion. And suspicion is isolating. But here's what mattered. It was too late for her to rewrite the sequence, because I had stepped into it first. Have you ever realized that the difference between being destroyed by a narrative and surviving it is simply who documented it first? She called 3 days later. Not from her usual number, an international line with heavy encryption masking. I let it ring once before answering. "Belle?" Her voice was steady, controlled, as if we were discussing a delayed flight, not an international investigation. "You moved earlier than I expected," she said. There it was. Not denial, not confusion, recognition. "I documented what I needed to," I replied. A brief silence, not emotional, analytical. "You could have come to me," she said finally. The sentence might have once carried weight. Now it sounded procedural, like a missed business alignment. "If I had," I answered calmly, "you would have accelerated your exit." Another pause, slight exhale. "That's not fair," she said. "Fair." The word hovered between us, fragile and irrelevant. "You built contingency clauses tied to my exposure," I said. No accusation in my tone, just a fact. "You positioned me as the architect. That wasn't accidental." She didn't argue the structure. She shifted the framing. "I built something scalable," she said. "You were the strongest front, clean background, institutional credibility. It was strategic. Strategic. Not maternal, not protective. Strategic. I didn't consent to that role." "Please." "You benefited from proximity," she countered softly. "Access, influence, knowledge." There was no shouting, no raised voices, just two adults speaking in measured cadence across continents. "You miscalculated one thing," I said, "and that is that I would prioritize loyalty over sequence." Silence stretched longer this time. When she spoke again, her tone was different, not angry, curious. "So what happens now?" "I continue cooperating," as I said, "and you continue running. You think they'll catch me? I think time narrows options." She laughed once, not warmly, not cruelly, just acknowledging the game. "You were always better with timelines," she said. That might have once been praise. Now it felt like closure. There was no apology, no dramatic confession, no tearful reconciliation, because confrontation without heat reveals something colder than anger, truth without distortion. "You could still redirect some of the assets," she said quietly. "Control the narrative differently." It was an offer, not maternal concern, strategic alliance. "No," I answered. Not loudly, not emotionally, just firmly. Another long silence. Then, "You're choosing integrity over advantage." "Yes." "That's expensive," Kazushiko said. "So is betrayal," I replied. I sighed. She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. Not remorseful, but reflective. "I underestimated you." "I know." The line disconnected without a goodbye. And that was the final confrontation. Not explosive, not cinematic. Just two people acknowledging that the structure between them had collapsed. And neither was attempting to rebuild it. Have you ever ended something not with anger, but with clarity so complete that nothing more needed to be said? It's been 18 months. Investigations move slowly, especially across borders. Court filings accumulate. Asset recovery proceedings unfold in layers. Extradition efforts continue in quiet diplomatic channels. My name was formally cleared as the primary architect 6 months after the raid. The language in the public record shifted carefully, from mastermind to identity misused in a structured fraud network. It wasn't a dramatic announcement, just a correction. And corrections rarely travel as loudly as accusations. Some people still look at me differently. When you've once been associated with a global scam ring, even inaccurately, that shadow lingers in certain conversations. But here's what changed most. I no longer measure my worth by usefulness. For years, I believed being reliable meant being valuable. That if I stayed calm, competent, and supportive, I would be protected by the logic of my own integrity. I was wrong about the protection part. Integrity doesn't shield you from being used. It only determines how you respond when you realize you have been. I still work in compliance, though in a different capacity now. I consult on identity misuse and layered fraud detection frameworks. Not because I want to relive what happened, but because I understand how easily predictable people can become infrastructure in someone else's architecture. I speak less in meetings than some colleagues. I still observe more than I announce. But the difference is this: my silence is no longer automatic. It is chosen. There's a quiet confidence that comes from surviving public suspicion without collapsing into bitterness. I didn't destroy her. I didn't chase headlines. I didn't humiliate anyone publicly. I documented. I disclosed. I stepped ahead of the narrative before it consumed me. Sometimes people ask if I hate her. I don't. Hatred would require emotional investment in a structure that no longer exists. What I feel is distance and clarity. She built a system that relied on my predictability. I rebuilt myself around intentional unpredictability, not in chaos, in boundaries. I no longer sign documents without full contextual control. I no longer answer strategic questions framed as casual curiosity. I no longer confuse praise for safety. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer need to be the foundation for anyone else's ambition. If I am infrastructure now, it is for my own life. Have you ever rebuilt yourself, not louder, not harder, but simply clearer about where you end and someone else begins? If you've listened this far, you already understand something important. This was never just about fraud. It was about roles, about how easily we can be cast in someone else's narrative without realizing the script is being written around us, about how praise can become positioning, how usefulness can become a liability, how silence can mean obedience until it becomes strategy. I wasn't saved by luck. I wasn't rescued by a dramatic revelation. I survived because I paid attention to the sequence, because I chose documentation over confrontation, because I stepped into scrutiny before scrutiny stepped into me, and because I accepted something difficult. Loyalty without boundaries is vulnerability. For a long time, I thought being calm meant being safe. If I stayed rational and helpful, the people closest to me would protect me from harm. But the truth is quieter than that. Sometimes, the people who understand your strengths the most are the ones who know exactly how to use them. The lesson wasn't about becoming suspicious of everyone. It wasn't about hardening my heart or cutting off the connection entirely. It was about clarity. Clarity about consent. Clarity about documentation. Clarity about where responsibility ends. If you ever find yourself inside a narrative that doesn't feel yours entirely, pause. Not to explode, not to accuse, to observe, to document, to decide deliberately which version of the story you're willing to stand behind. Because once a structure collapses, the only thing that remains is sequence. And the sequence tells the truth. I'm not the mastermind they once labeled me. I'm not the invisible foundation I used to be either. I'm simply someone who learned, perhaps the hardest way possible, that quiet people can move strategically. And that integrity, when paired with timing, is stronger than spectacle. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever realized that the most powerful move you can make isn't loud confrontation, but stepping ahead of the story before it defines you? I'd genuinely like to know what you think.